Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia. This is our weekly link-up with our bureaus in Moscow, Washington, D.C. and here in London. My name is Brendan Cole. It's been a fast-moving week, indeed a fast-moving day in Ukraine, and the crisis that has pitted nations and diplomats against each other is deepening. For Russia, the glow of its Sochi Olympics that it was basking in has been replaced by heavy criticism in many quarters in the West after pro-Russian and Russian forces took de facto control of the Crimean Peninsula. It followed the fall and subsequent flight of the President Viktor Yanukovych. Today, MPs in the Crimea asked Moscow to allow the southern Ukrainian region to become part of the Russian Federation. The parliament said if its request were granted, Crimean citizens could give their view in a referendum to take place on March the 16th. But a government minister in Kiev said this would be unconstitutional for Crimea to join Russia. The announcement from Crimea's parliament comes as EU leaders meet in Brussels to discuss how to respond to this crisis. How will the crisis in Ukraine and the Crimea play out? What does the West, Kiev and Moscow do now? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined here in our London studio by Liam Halligan. He's a columnist for The Telegraph and was also an asset manager in Moscow. Also here is Charles Crawford, who is an international negotiations consultant. He previously served with the UK Foreign Office in Russia in the early 1990s and then in Poland from 2003 to 2007 as the British ambassador to Warsaw. Also here in the studio is Vera Graziadei. She's a Ukrainian Russian based in London. She's from the city of Donetsk. And on the line in Washington, D.C., we have Francis Boyle. He's a professor at the University of Illinois College of Law, and he wrote the book Tackling America's Toughest Questions. We'll also be joined by the Voice of Russia's political analyst, Dmitry Babich, in Moscow. A warm welcome to you all. Dmitry, actually, I would like to touch on your views first. Just with the developments this afternoon, the Crimea asking Moscow to allow the southern Ukrainian region to become part of the Russian Federation. What will Moscow's response be to this if there is a yes in the referendum? I mean, is there a way for Moscow to ignore that?
Well, I'm not sure that Moscow will say yes, because there have been precedents before. South Ossetia, separatist region in Georgia in 2008 also asked to be included in the Russian Federation, and Moscow politely said no, although Moscow diplomatically recognized South Ossetia, which was a big scandal internationally. So I think that the Crimean authorities, the Crimean parliament and probably the Crimean government, when they took that decision, they want to guarantee their own security. I can understand their motives. The problem is that if Russia's policy changes in a few years or in a few months, if, for example, President Putin steps down after the next election or before the next election, then they will be left face to face with Kiev. And they have reasons to be concerned about their security, because in Kiev right now we have a government where 4 ministerial posts are occupied by representatives of the Svoboda Party, formerly the National Social Party of Ukraine, which has in its program, it's written that autonomy of Crimea should be abolished, and its program also includes positions on criminal punishment for any kind of Ukrainophobia. So obviously they have nothing good to expect from the Ukrainian government, and they want to make sure that they will be protected in future. But I'm not sure that Moscow will grant, this total sort of recognition of Crimea's wishes. I think that right now the purpose of President Putin is to draw the red lines which the new government in Kiev should not cross. It's not to make Crimea part of Russia.
Okay, well, look, Vera Graziadei, you're from Donetsk, and I'm just wondering what you think of the comments made this afternoon by Arseniy Yatsenyuk. He's the interim prime minister from the Fatherland Party. He makes the point that he wants Ukraine to stay united. Do you have confidence that he can achieve that goal?
I'm getting quite mixed reports from Donetsk. Most of my friends who are professionals and have good jobs, they seem to be quite pro-united Ukraine. But I'm getting a lot of video evidence of thousands of people marching on the streets of Donetsk, demanding to have a referendum to decide themselves whether they want to be part of the country whose government they don't recognize as legitimate. Today I've heard that the leader of this movement, Pavel Gubarev, has been arrested by the order of SBU, and there are threats that people who will be doing further demonstrations on the streets of Donetsk will also be arrested. Now, of course, the situation mirrors quite significantly what could happen in Crimea with Tatars, they equally could start demonstrating against it. But of course, we see the response of the Ukrainian government. They arrest the leader and they threaten people with either them losing their jobs or arrest.
So you're saying that potentially Donetsk, your home city, could be the next flashpoint. What we're seeing in Crimea will be repeated in Russian areas, or predominantly Russian-speaking areas of eastern Ukraine and cities such as that.
I'm very concerned about it because the people are saying that they can actually start calling on Putin's help to protect them, and arrest is a threat to their autonomy. They have been demonstrating and pretty much mirroring the protests that have been taking part in Kiev in February. But the response to their protests, which have been quite peaceful, apart from then taking hold of the administration building, which they claim they haven't broken any laws which already haven't been broken, which is an arguable point, they are being threatened. And
that administrative building that you're talking about, flags of Ukrainian and Russian colours have been hoisted and taken down and hoisted up again. But Charles Crawford, do you think that Kiev is able to placate these southern and eastern regions of Ukraine? Yatsenyuk he's speaking very eloquently on the world stage, but I'm wondering whether they have the wherewithal, the capability of actually doing that.
Well, look, you can look at this on many different levels simultaneously. This is a great historical drama, and it's stuff which is happening this afternoon. I think, if I can say so, what Dmitry said is very important. The key thing which has driven European security for the last, 40, 50 years, is the proposition that borders cannot be changed without the consent of all concerned. So if Russia were to recognize Crimea as being part of Russia in the face of clearly all concerned, including the government in Kiev, that would be an extraordinary step, which would take us into a totally different world. And Russia has not recognized Kosovo because it said Belgrade is part of all concerned. Belgrade doesn't recognize Kosovo. So all sorts of really quite radical propositions would flow from that, including perhaps in due course threats to Russia itself from bits of Russia saying, hang on a minute, we'd like to go somewhere else. So this is, Actually, personally, I think Dmitry must be right, because I cannot imagine the Russians would want to take a step which is so contrary to international law. Having said that, listening to what Vera said and what you've said and watching the whole thing, the issue of people coming against each other who are naturally very close is very psychologically disturbing. We all know from our own families, the worst fights you have are with your family, then with your friends, and then with people thousands of miles away. And once things in a family tip over into something much blacker, it can just get completely out of hand. So, and then in a sense, for a country this size, this isn't South Ossetia, this is 45 million people in Europe getting into a deeply psychologically unhappy state.
Liam, do you think it's a combination of factors that have really tipped things over? Because clearly there was protest and unhappiness at the decision by Yanukovych turning away from the EU association agreement. But do you think that he really made the argument that the EU association agreement wasn't particularly good for Ukraine economically, and that was a mistake that he made? And actually, Ukrainians who are clamouring for closer ties with Russia don't actually realise just what kind of dire straits financially they are in.
I think they're certainly in financial dire straits. That's worth mentioning. The sword of Damocles over all these really historic events, as Charles said, are it sounds banal, but events often are, is a series of debt interest payments which must be met over the next 4 to 6 months to stop Ukraine defaulting. As Charles says, this is a big economy, and Ukraine needs $10 to $15 billion of hard cash within a few weeks.
Are they going to get that?
We'll come on to that. If they don't get that, then the situation, already bad and tumultuous, is going to look a lot worse. This crisis does have its roots in economics, in money, as so many family squabbles, of course. I think the mistake that the EU made, if I may say so, is that they tried to force Ukraine to choose between their trade deal and the loose trade affiliation that Moscow was offering with other former Soviet states and so on. And I think a lot of Ukrainian business folk and citizens felt that, even if they were pretty pro the idea of being close to Europe, even those in the West, there was quite a lot of cynicism about what Europe was offering. There was no access, serious access for Ukraine's agricultural goods, of course, because of the common agricultural policy. There was an awful lot of warm words and a few kind of scholarships kicking around for the elites, but very little hard cash. What Moscow was offering was the option to join a trade association with Russia, which, of course, in the end, the Ukrainian economy just tessellates a lot better with the Russian economy. It's just an evolutionary fact. So the spectre of a sovereign default is overhanging these negotiations. And, of course, there's an awful lot for the West to lose. That's why I said on BBC Radio Today programme earlier this week, and have been pilloried for it, that the idea of sanctions against Russia was pretty mad. But that seems to be where both the British and the American governments, after their sabre-rattling, have ended up, given the really large financial and commercial vested interests within the West, particularly in Germany, often unstated.
Which is Russia's biggest trading partner. So you're saying it would hurt the West as much as it would hurt Russia?
Not only is Germany Russia's biggest single country trading partner, Russia is Germany's biggest single country trading partner. To live and to work in Russia, I mean, what the Germans have done in Russia post-communism commercially is quite staggering. And it's not just VW, Siemens, Liebherr, and all the rest of them. It's many, many thousands of Mittelstand companies that are under the radar. They're not listed on any stock exchange. Their ownership is private. But they are doing enormous business in Russia's regions. And, of course, Russia's got its own, between Russia and Germany, there's a single private pipeline called Nord Stream, which means that Germany is not, even though it gets a lot of its gas from Russia, it's not nearly as vulnerable to those gas pipelines which cross Ukraine. And it strikes me that in Dublin today, Merkel really is the only person who can negotiate mano a mano, if you like. I'm being ironic, but it's true, with the Russians.
Now, Francis Boyle in Washington, what about the American response? I mean, Russia and Europe economically are closely intertwined, as Liam was outlining there. The US less so. Is John Kerry... What's he doing? Is he playing it right this week? He's making some kinds of sort of vague threats, but short of, I mean, visa restrictions on Russians and Ukrainians isn't really going to make much difference, is it?
No, I'm afraid that what we're seeing is escalation of the crisis by the United States government. As you know, President Putin ordered the Russian troops, 150,000 Russian troops there right off the border of Ukraine on war maneuvers to stand down, which I saw as a very positive sign. And yet immediately NATO responded, and the United States is NATO, by deploying new forces to Russia and the Baltics, despite the fact there's no threat to Russia in the Baltics. And now, as we're seeing today, these new sanctions. So I'm afraid that rather than pick up on the opportunity offered by President Putin standing down, Kerry's just escalating. That meeting he had with Foreign Minister Lavrov, he brought along Artsenyuk, but Lavrov made it very clear that he did not consider him to be democratically elected at all, and he wasn't going to meet with him. I think if Kerry were serious, he would go to Moscow and meet with President Putin and attempt to negotiate a way out of here. I do agree with both Mr. Babich and Mr. Crawford that I don't believe that at this point in time Russia should annex Crimea. It would only exacerbate the situation. But I do have to say that under the relevant standards of international law, given what's gone on here, certainly under the Declaration of Principles of International Law and the advisory opinion of the World Court on Kosovo's Declaration of Independence, the people of Crimea have a right to secede if they want to. I'm not saying they should. But even if they vote in this upcoming referendum, I would think the prudent thing to do for the Russian parliament is to sit on it and not do anything right now and see if we can negotiate a way out of this dilemma.
Can I get Charles's response to that? Charles, I mean, you did make the point that this would be a sea change in thinking if Crimea did exit the fold of Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin has made... he's been very vocal in his defence of sovereignty over the last 15 years as president and prime minister, the importance of sovereignty. He's a statist. He believes in the integrity of a state. Are we seeing a change in his thinking?
Well, it's hard to say, because his interview the other day he said pretty much in terms, I think, that he does not want to change borders. And that's a pretty big deal. And I don't want to argue too much with the previous speaker. I wouldn't interpret the ICJ judgment on Kosovo in quite the way he does. But be all this as it may, where I think what you do as a diplomat is you build upon what you've got in common. And the first thing President Putin said in his press conference the other day was that Ukrainians are fed up with thieves of different shapes and sizes running Ukraine. Now, that seems like a pretty sort of important proposition. I would have thought that we must be pretty fed up with the thieves running Ukraine. The basic deal is, how do we in Europe and Russia find legitimate Ukrainian partners to clean up everyone's act? And that seems to me the best place to start. And I'm as hawkish as the next person on communism and ex-communism and goodness knows what. But I personally feel uncomfortable with this sort of idea of putting sanctions on Russia. It's a UN Security Council permanent member. This is just not going to work. Russia will just laugh at this, and anything we do to them, they will do worse to us.
Vera, what's the plight of people in Ukraine that you know, and what are they telling you? I mean, how are they feeling about matters at the moment? I mean, clearly there's an economic crisis, there's a political crisis. What are they saying?
Well, it's a country which just have gone through really traumatic times. So I think people are quite traumatized. So even people who feel that their narrative, so to speak, has won, which is Euromaidan, and I call it narrative because I felt there was an information war as much there was a seizure of power by force. Euromaidan have had quite a sophisticated PR campaign, which seemed to have been quite remarkably prepared right from the beginning of the demonstrations. And they have been really pushing this narrative and shaming publicly people who do not support it on their media. So I think I find it very difficult to speak with people in Ukraine. Some of my friends are frightened to discuss matters on Facebook and have asked me to try and speak to them in person. I get a sense that people are truly frightened to speak up their mind.
And so you have no faith in the ability of the interim government to kind of bring to heel those extremist elements, and there are extremist elements in a minority in the government, and who spearheaded the Maidan revolution.
I have a feeling that these pro-Russian forces in the eastern part of Ukraine, specifically in Donetsk and Odessa and Kharkov, they will be becoming stronger if people will be persecuted. There will be similar mirror situation that has happened in Kiev as soon as the President Yanukovych has been pushing the protesters down, people stand up. So I feel that it will be very difficult for them to reconcile it. And they're not trying to make any steps towards these people. Quite the opposite. They today have been encouraging everybody to only speak Ukrainian, to show that we're all Ukrainian, we're all one united Ukraine. So how do Russian people who don't speak Ukrainian feel about it, even if they are pro-united Ukraine?
And Dmitry Babich, that has alienated a good proportion of the Russian-speaking population. Russian is no longer an official language in Ukraine.
Well, it has not been an official language since 1991, which is a travesty because Ukraine is by its destiny a bilingual country. But unfortunately, I think this whole affair is a massive favor of the EU and the West in general. And I'm not just speaking about the support that the EU and the United States gave to Ukrainian staying the only state language and not even making Russian official language, as three presidents promised. Kuchma promised that, Yanukovych promised that, and even Kravchuk promised that, and they never fulfilled their promises. But let's remember, how it all started. It all started from a relatively minor controversy. Yanukovych asked to postpone signing the association agreement with the EU. He didn't cancel it. He was actually pro-European. It was clear that he wanted more to go to the European Union than to the customs union with Russia. And the EU was so intransigent that little by little the situation got into a deadlock where we are now. And now I think very soon everyone will forget about this godforsaken association agreement which started the whole thing.
Although, Dmitry, to be fair, sorry for interrupting though, Dmitry, most people would accept that he had considerable shortcomings as president. He could have explained better the association agreement. He could have taken it to the people. He could have said, this will throw millions of people out of work. This is not good for our economy. He never did that.
I'll tell you, he explained it several times, but Euromaidan already started, and as Vera said, it had a very good PR campaign. So anyone saying that was immediately portrayed in the Ukrainian media as a traitor, as stooge of Moscow. You know, I understand Ukrainian like most Russians, so I followed that campaign very closely. But unfortunately, what I want to say is, you know, speaking about the West's carrots and sticks, unfortunately, this intransigent policy continues, because if you look at the list of people who will have their assets frozen in the West, if they have any, who will have their visas cancelled, they include Nikolai Azarov, the former prime minister, who obviously had nothing to do with violence, and he obviously wanted to sign that agreement. It was clear from a lot of his statements. For some reason, this list includes the education minister Dmitry Babich. He was hated by the Ukrainian nationalists because he wanted Tolstoy and Pushkin to be taught at Ukrainian schools again. Before, they haven't been even taught at Ukrainian schools because they were considered to be foreign writers. Although, you know, Tolstoy and Gogol, for example, who was born in Ukraine, they are not quite, they wrote in Russian, but they are not alien to Ukraine.
Okay.
Basically, why include these people in this list? You know, the problem is that this list shows that the same intransigent policy continues.
And what about NATO, though? I mean, Liam Halligan, it's not just about the EU. Putin has for years said that he doesn't like the encroachment of NATO on Russian borders. He sees this as a potential way of making sure that doesn't happen. No one's really talking about NATO, though, are they?
They're not, because in the end, there's never been a single opinion poll in Ukraine in favour of NATO membership. That's just the reality. Ukraine doesn't want to be part of NATO, however much Western capitals may fantasise that it does. The big mistake the EU made, and it almost made it seems deliberately, is that it tried to force Ukraine to choose between Western Europe and Russia. That's not what Ukraine is. Ukraine's destiny isn't only to be a bilingual nation, as we just heard from Dmitry. It's also to be the bridge between the West European and the Slavic world. That's what it is, and it can do that job extremely well, if only it was allowed to do so. Another thing I wanted to mention is that, of course, Yanukovych was by no means a perfect president in any way, and a lot of his behaviour has been, you know, at best thuggish, at worst criminal. But the reality is he was elected in 2010, and the OSCE, which of course is backed by all the Western powers, in its monitoring report of that election, it called it fair, balanced, and a good example of democracy. Certainly a big step forward from the previous presidential election. So if the Ukrainian people as a whole wanted to get rid of their president, and they probably would have got rid of their president in 2015, the election was just around the corner, then that would have happened. That has to be for them to decide. And when we go around as Western Europeans or as Americans trying to impose our will, and particularly when we say incredibly crass things like the US Secretary of State, forgive me, you know, it's not right to invade countries with no pretext, we just make ourselves look ridiculous, frankly.
And on that United States point of view, Francis Boyle, I suppose Vladimir Putin can easily say, and certainly Sergei Lavrov can say, well, look, don't denounce what's happened in Crimea as brutal aggression. Look at Iraq, look at Libya, look at Afghanistan. I mean, the moral high ground has clearly been lost, I suppose, in Vladimir Putin's eyes, on the part of John Kerry.
Well, they've already said that, and indeed, when he was a senator, Kerry voted for the invasion of Iraq. Even those of us, despite the fact those of us here in the United States opposed, saying at the time there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So he has no credibility at all. But I did want to go back, though, to Mr. Halligan's point. I just talked about NATO. And as a matter of fact, Ukraine is, as we speak today, a member of Partnership for Peace, which is the antechamber for NATO. And the latest report I just saw at the wire services today is that the Ukrainian Rada has prepared legislation asking for accession to NATO. Now, I don't think that's going to happen for the same reason it didn't happen the last time when Bush tried it, because then, the NATO states would be obligated to go to war on behalf of Ukraine and under the current
and nobody wants that, right?
No, of course not. But we could see the Western Ukraine and Kiev becoming a de facto participant in NATO if, in fact, we see NATO troops enter into Ukraine, which, as we know now, there are NATO forces on maneuvers in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Poland. So, this could be the sub silentio agenda here. I think we need to pay attention to that. As for Mr. Crawford's aspersions on my interpretation of the Kosovo advisory opinion, well, I'm a professor of international law. I've argued in the World Court. I single-handedly won 2 World Court orders for Bosnia, overwhelmingly in their favor. The first time this ever happened in the history of the World Court, going back to 1921.
Okay, Francis.
And under that advisory opinion, the people in Crimea can vote validly to revert to Russia. But I am not suggesting that Russia agree to that, because I think we're all in agreement at this point that would only exacerbate the situation.
And what would exacerbate the situation, Charles Crawford, is this NATO presence. If they come into Crimea, nobody wants a war. I mean, what's going to happen there?
If who comes into Crimea?
Well, if as Francis makes the point that there is a vote on closer ties with NATO with Ukraine, they're never going to join NATO. They didn't in 2008, but that would change the standing of what's going on, though, won't it?
Well, fundamentally, look, in real life, in diplomacy, there are, roughly speaking, 3 broad possibilities. Either the extremes expand and squeeze the middle, or the middle expands and squeezes the extremes, or you get a messy sort of thing sloshing backwards and forwards and no one's quite sure what's going on. The risk in this situation is that the extremes will expand and squeeze out the normal people in the middle. You will end up, in a sort of absurd, it must be NATO or it must be Russia situation, whereas everyone seems to be agreeing that Ukraine doesn't want to have that choice. And if you want to partition the thing, that would be very destructive.
What about the agreement in 1994, Vera? There was an agreement that from all sides that Russia wouldn't do this. I mean, do you see that this is breaking that agreement?
It could be interpreted like that. I'm not a specialist in international law, and I'll leave it up to specialists to decide. But the argument was that it is protecting the Russian people in Crimea and Ukraine. And speaking to Russian people in Crimea, they truly were terrified during the protesting in Kiev and felt relieved and very happy when the Russian army arrived in Crimea. There were all these pictures of people giving them flowers. There were celebrations everywhere. It was really happy times for Russians. I'm not saying that it was happy times for Tatars. My Tatar friend was very, very upset, and she was crying to me on the phone about it. So I'm aware of that dimension as well. But I think there was something in that argument that Russians needed that salvation. I think their ethnicity was threatened.
And the Tatar question in Crimea, I mean, clearly, okay, let's say Russians feel under threat, but Tatars must be feeling very uneasy at the moment.
They're feeling very uneasy because in the history of their culture, of course, Stalin has deported them from Crimea before. So the arrival of Russians to Tatars who don't follow foreign affairs and geopolitics seems to be that now they're going to start putting them all in trains and sending them to Russia. So it's simple, more peasantry population were very frightened. The leader of the Tatarstan, of the Tatarstan Republic of Russia, has arrived yesterday in Crimea and had a talk with the leader of the Tatars in Crimea. I was trying very desperately to find the results of the meeting, but the hope was there for some communication between these two republics, and hopefully there will be support from Tatarstan to help Tatars in Crimea to feel secure.
On the financial question, Liam, you mentioned 15 billion needs to get its way to Ukraine pretty quick, or else we could face implosion. Who's going to give that money? The IMF are going to step in, I guess, the EU, but who do you think will ultimately cough up the cash in the next month or so?
Well, I think we could turn a problem into at least part of the solution by having a joint funding of the bailout fund for Ukraine. That would surely go beyond symbolism. All sides putting hard cash on the table. The Russians, of course, can certainly afford it. They've got the world's fourth biggest foreign exchange reserves. So it'd be a combination of EU, led by Germany, Russian and IMF money. And it really is important to say just how much more the EU have got in this financially than the US. Of course, this whole situation has become a political plaything for America because of Obama's reset. You know, there are people on Capitol Hill, if a typhoon hit Alabama, it would be the fault of Obama's reset with Russia. And clearly Kerry has to react to that with his nonsensical words. But the EU really has got a huge amount of financial and economic stake in Russia. And it strikes me that the funding proportions should be commensurate with that. One only hopes that this can happen pretty quickly, so we don't get into a situation where a Ukrainian default becomes a sword of Damocles over the broader global financial system, because it certainly does have the capacity, the potential to be a spark, a tinderbox that could cause systemic fallout across global markets, and that would be particularly bad for the region because we are so far on economically from where we were. The 1998 crisis, the so-called Russia crisis, is actually a Thailand crisis for anybody that knows anything about financial markets. But of course, it became the Russia crisis. We are so far on from that. The main economy in the region has gone from being a $200 billion economy back in those days to a $2 trillion economy. It's gone from being the IMF's biggest debtor to being one of the world's only sovereign creditors. There's a lot more financial stability in this region, not least from Russia. And one hopes that we can put together a bailout package that is seen to be transparent, non-corrupt, and can do the job of allowing the Ukrainian economy some room for manoeuvre, so it can become, with its massive agricultural, human capital assets, and its coal, of course, and hopefully steel prices will recover a little bit to help it, a serious commercially viable place, which it should obviously be.
And if it does become a commercially viable place, Dmitry Babich, we could have the prospect in a few months' time of more protests in the street, more protests in Kiev. This is just an interim government. I mean, it doesn't look like it's going to stabilise anytime soon. What do you think?
Well, I just wanted to say that, remember, in November, Yanukovych was asking for money to actually help him stay afloat, and then he would sign that association agreement. So wouldn't it be wiser to give that money, which the EU is now promising Yanukovych, then? It would probably solve the problem, and we wouldn't be in such a difficult situation right now. But indeed, I foresee that there will be a lot of problems, because clearly Ukraine was put before a choice it didn't want to make. And I hope that this crisis will teach us something. It will teach us that we don't have and we shouldn't put Ukraine before this so-called civilizational choice. Russia and the West should work together to make Ukraine again, I repeat, again, a democratic nation, because you can't have democracy when nearly 100 people, both policemen and protesters, are killed in a matter of a few days in Kiev.
Okay, well, look, we're running out of time, Charles. I just want to get your view on, I mean, there is a fragile communication line, one could say, between the Russian and Ukrainian governments. There at Kiev and Simferopol are setting up a commission to discuss some kind of common strategy. I'm wondering, do you think, in your view, is negotiation beginning to reassert itself over confrontation?
Maybe. You can see the essence, listening to what everyone has said. There's the essence of a deal between West, if you can call it that, US, EU and Russia and Ukraine. You know, part of it involves money. Part of it involves language rights for everybody. Part of it involves some sort of security guarantees. So this issue of where, you know, which camp you're in is taken off the table sort of for a while, or if not indefinitely. You know, you can see how a big deal could be put together. But that would mean all of us giving things up. And it would actually mean Russia, I think, committing to a level of transparency and integrity in Ukraine, which so far, frankly, it hasn't done. So the risk, I think, is that there may be people out there, including in Russia, extremists of different shapes and sizes in Ukraine, and for all I know in the West, who don't want that deal.
Great. Well, that's a nice place to leave it. Sadly, we've run out of time. That's Charles Crawford, an international negotiations consultant who used to serve with the UK Foreign Office. Joining me in the studio also here was Vera Graziadei, who's a Ukrainian-Russian actor based in London. She's from Donetsk. Also here, Liam Halligan, columnist for the Telegraph and a former asset manager based in Moscow. From Washington, D.C., we had Francis Boyle, professor at the University of Illinois College of Law and author of the book Tackling America's Toughest Questions. And, of course, in Moscow, the political analyst for Voice of Russia, Dmitry Babich. Thank you very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on the Voice of Russia in London.